All right, let's talk through evidence and commentary. This is kind of a review, but now we're talking about it in terms of your own writing. Like we talked about in our reading unit, evidence is the support that an author provides, while commentary is where they kind of elaborate and link that evidence to their thesis. So I wanted to show you what's called the Toulmin model of argument. It sounds fancy, but really it's just kind of a way of organizing your body paragraphs to organize your thinking so that whenever you are making an argument, it is effective, okay? And so the terms that we're familiar with are thesis, evidence, and commentary. And those are all pieces of the Toulmin model as well. If you want to know how to spell Toulmin, it's spelled like that. But another way to think about it is, here's my claim. I have data or evidence and the warrant. The reason I point out this other language is because commentary is something that's kind of hard to describe and explain. But if you think about a warrant, when a police officer needs to create a warrant, they need to create a rationale of why that person should be arrested. So they have their claim that someone should be arrested. They have the evidence, which is the data. And then the warrant is the write-up that allows them to go and arrest that person. So it works the same way in our world. It's just the claim is the thesis, the data is the evidence, and the warrant is the commentary. And the reason we use this language is that's what the AP has kind of sent out as their language. So I'm not trying to confuse you. I just think that the Toulmin model with claim, data, and warrant kind of explains what commentary is a little better by having that visual of the warrant where the police officer, justifies their arrest. So I put it on a circle here because all of these things kind of work together. So I set my claim, I support that claim with data, and then I explain the data, and then I link that warrant is my link back to claim. So whenever we're thinking about a body paragraph, those are the three pieces that we need, and that's kind of why with critical reading we were annotating for those things, because as writers we should do the same things we see in our reading, okay? So let's start with evidence. Now in my thesis development video, I kind of went over the different types of prompts, so you got a little bit of a preview of what they look like. But each of them kind of utilize evidence differently and pull from different places. So I wanted to talk about what type of evidence you would use for each. With synthesis, if you remember, there's the 6 to 7 sources are provided. And obviously your evidence comes from theirs, and you can quote, you can paraphrase, or summarize the information provided in those sources. However, you can also cite outside evidence. So for example, if there is the value of college prompt that we looked at in the thesis model, if you have an older sibling in college that is struggling with their student loan debt, if you have examples from your reading in the news or outside world, and if it's relevant, you should definitely put it into your synthesis, because while they are providing you with 6 to 7 sources, and you are required to use 3, remember you have to use 3, if you bring in your own evidence to support the argument, it's going to be a more sophisticated argument. So with synthesis, your information comes from the sources provided and from any outside information you may have. With rhetorical analysis, it's all going to come from the passage. There's no need to cite anything outside the passage, and you can quote it or paraphrase it, or, as we'll talk about later, a combination of the two. But all of your evidence should come from your rhetorical analysis passage. Now, your reader will have read the passage many times. I read question 2 this last summer, and I read the passage multiple times every single day. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't provide direct quotes from the passages to support what I'm talking about. A common mistake is just to say, in lines 3 and 4, the author does this, whereas more so than that, we want to talk about pull a quote from that or a paraphrase from the passage to illustrate what we're talking about. But all evidence will come from the passage. Now, argument, the evidence is all going to come from you. So I have an acronym of the sort of evidence you can use, and that is SURE. And what that includes is any science or technology that you know about, if it's relevant. For example, I'm trying to think about a past prompt where science, for example, there's a prompt about how people use humor to create their argument. And you could cite someone like Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are popular scientists that use humor to kind of make their complicated science more palatable. So science and technology is what S stands for. So I can pull evidence from there. I can pull evidence from history. That's why I've been saying that paying attention in AP US history and US history is super important, because a lot of the best evidence comes from history, for sure. The O is for observations, but I would like to make that a little bit more specific to news and pop culture. Observations is kind of general, I think, and that can kind of encompass a lot of different things. But we're talking about your observations of the world. So what have you heard in the news? What do you notice about pop culture? Pop culture being movies, media, music, things like that. The R you can pull from your reading. In the past, we kind of talked about how you shouldn't pull from fiction reading, but I have been a reader for question 3 now, and if you have a literary example, you can sure use it, as long as you explain it well. But any reading that you can pull from would be an appropriate source of evidence for the argument question as well. And then there's experience. Now, this, just like with ACT, I think, is where students are most compelled to pull from. It's easier to pull from your own experiences when relevant, and the prompts are designed that you can pull from personal experience. But just to kind of illustrate the dangers of doing that, 2 summers ago I read question 3, and the question was about the unknown. So many students talked about situations where they had faced their own unknown. And at the very top end, a great example of an essay that scored very high was she talked about how because she was a minority student, something like the unknown wasn't a good thing. And in fact, that unknown was just a privilege for the majority. So by pointing out her personal experience as being a Hispanic American person who didn't know if her parents were going to be home by the time she got home because of ICE deportations, that is a very powerful personal example about how what the value of the unknown is. Same question, same summer, I also read a essay by a girl who talked about how she tried a chicken burrito once, and that was her example of facing the unknown. So looking at these 2 examples side by side, they were used for the same essay. They're both examples of personal experience with the topic, but you can tell which of those is a more successful example. Obviously, the student who brought in her experience as a minority student pulled from personal experience that was very valuable and unique to her. Whereas Burrito Girl over here pulled out something that was very superficial when using personal experience. So I'm going to put a little asterisk next to experience at the bottom here, because if you have to use it, of course, you can use it. But I would say these, the SHOR of the acronym, are going to create a more successful, higher scoring essay. So that's kind of our overview of the different types of evidence you use on the questions. Like I said, with synthesis, you use those provided sources as well as any outside evidence you can think of. Rhetorical analysis, you are just going to cite from the passage or paraphrase from the passage. But argument, it's all up to you. So you have to think about how you can work through these different categories to pick out the best evidence for your essay. So that said, let's talk about how we integrate that evidence. This is something I've kind of already noticed in our writing, is that we do what's called a dropped quote. You might have had a teacher who called it a hanging quote, or an unintegrated quote, but we don't want to do that. What that looks like is just taking a quote and dropping it in without any lead in, without any transition between your words and theirs. And what that does is it ruins your fluency, but it also creates a disconnect between your writing and the evidence. It's a very kind of, and I hate to use this word, but it's an immature way of putting evidence into your writing. So an example would be like, if I was doing a rhetorical analysis, I might introduce a strategy, and then my next sentence would just all be a quote from the text. We don't want to do that. So I have 3 ways that you can avoid that, or 3 different methods of integrating your evidence. So we'll start with the one you're probably most familiar with, I think, and that's the lead-in method. So according to Florence Kelly, that would be a lead-in. But a lead-in is really kind of any introductory information, or like the author says blank. That would be a lead-in, meaning that you're leading into the evidence by kind of providing that context. Next one, another one that you're very familiar with, I'm sure, is a paraphrase, which just means put it in your own words. But, and this is a big thing to remember, it still needs to be specific enough that I could go and point exactly to the line you're referencing in the source, okay? So that means that if you are paraphrasing a couple sentences, you can switch out synonyms, you can point out, you can keep a few of the details, but remember, if we're paraphrasing, I need to be able to point exactly to where you're looking in that passage. And this one, like I said, you can use this one on rhetorical analysis, but especially since we are talking about the rhetoric and the language in rhetorical analysis, you'd want to use quoting more than paraphrasing. Okay, and then the last one, which is probably what I use the most and what more successful essays rely on, is a semi-paraphrase. So it's a mix of quoted material and paraphrasing. So, for example, a sentence typically has a subject and a predicate, those 2 parts. I might paraphrase the predicate but keep the subject the same and keep that part in quotation marks. What that does is it kind of creates this interwoven effect where I'm kind of moving in and out of the sources really seamlessly. So, for example, if this little squiggle here is a sentence, I might cut it in half at a logical place, and I'm going to keep this part exactly the quoted, but then I'm going to paraphrase the language of this beginning part. And as we look at high-scoring essays, you'll kind of see how they successfully do that, and how I do that in my own samples as well. So these are the 3 types of, or 3 methods, I should say, of integrating your evidence. I'll be perfectly honest, poorly integrated evidence is a pet peeve of mine. I don't try to hold it against you, but it does drive me crazy. So if you can take a minute as you're writing to make sure you're using one of these 3 methods, it's really going to elevate the quality of your writing. All right, and our last kind of piece of evidence here is to talk about evidence in that synthesis question. The word synthesis is the combination of sources to create a new argument. Okay, when I synthesize something, I'm bringing things together. So really, when we're talking about that synthesis prompt and those different sources, there's 2 ways we're going to do that. Either the sources are in agreement with one another, or they need to work against each other. So we have either consensus or counter-argument. Let's start with consensus because I think that's probably the easiest one. So that is when the sources agree, and one source is either elaborating or just supporting the argument of another. So for example, with your synthesis prompt, You have 6 sources. Source A and source D might be very similar in their argument. So a consensus paragraph, or a way of using that evidence, would point out, well, source A says this. Similarly, source D says this. Together, they make the argument that. That would be an example of consensus. So it's like source A plus B equals, your argument or your commentary, right? Now, counter argument is when the sources disagree. And a more sophisticated synthesis essay is going to be able to use this strategy. Because what it is doing is one source is refuting another. So we talked about counterclaims in our critical reading unit. It's the same thing, but in your writing, you're doing the same thing. So if I'm looking at source C and D, if C says college is worth the money, D says college is worth the money, I'm going to say source D says blank, however, source C, it's not very good, C says blank. Therefore, And there are resources in the synthesis folder for you on how to craft a really good counter-argument paragraph, but that's the biggest thing. You have the opponent or source, the first source says this, however, you have a switch word is what I call that. The accurate source says this. A couple of things to keep in mind with a counter-argument paragraph is you always start with the opposition. Because if you start by saying, I believe this, but source D says this, all you've done is kind of left that paragraph in the hands of source D. And what we want to do is start out by saying, here's what my opposition says, but they're wrong, and here's the evidence I have to prove that. So when we're talking about synthesis of evidence or for your synthesis prompt in general, it can do both of those. And your argument question 3 can as well. You can employ the same thing by thinking about in an argument question, what might an opponent say to me and what evidence do I have to prove them wrong? So that's kind of 2 ways of synthesizing evidence. So what is commentary? Like I said, commentary is that warrant, right? Warrant is the link that gets the person arrested. So what commentary is it's really any kind of elaboration, but most importantly, it explains the evidence, links to the topic sentence or the assertion, and it links your evidence to your overall thesis. So really, the commentary is where you're building the argument, okay? So to kind of review what we kind of just went, there's a pretty basic checklist you can use when you are developing rich commentary. And the first one is to explain any evidence. So in this situation, if you are looking at like a really difficult, oddly worded rhetorical analysis, you might need to paraphrase what the author was saying for clarity purpose, right? You might need to provide context. If you are pulling a quote from a synthesis source, but standing alone it doesn't really make sense, you might need to provide a little bit of context from that source to bolster it. This step, explaining any evidence, is not always necessary. And it's hard to see when you need it. But like I said, the 2 times when I think most commonly you need to explain the evidence is 1, when you're looking at a difficult quotation, so it needs a little bit of paraphrasing and explanation for clarity purposes. Or 2, if you're pulling from a source where there's context that's relevant to the quote you're providing. So that's step 1 of the checklist. 2 is to link to the topic sentence or to the assertion. All right, so like with rhetorical analysis, I need to explain the strategy, and that's for rhetorical analysis specifically. in my argument, my persuasive writing, I need to link the evidence to my main ideas. So all those those chunks we talked about in our thesis video, those pieces of my reasoning, that line of reasoning is developed because in my body paragraphs, I link all of the evidence that I'm presenting back to that body paragraph's purpose, or the topic sentence that I started out with. Because if I just kind of move right to the thesis, I haven't really explained how it fits in with just that paragraph, and we need to accomplish both. And the third and most important is to link to your thesis. This, I would say, is the most oft-forgotten part of commentary. And I will always write a little ... with a circle if I see that you haven't connected back to your thesis. So at the end of every paragraph, the end of every body paragraph, you should be explaining, so what? What does that have to do with the overall argument, okay? These two steps always have to be done. This one, not necessarily. Alrighty. The next step that I have for you is a video in which I'm going to draft a body paragraph. As I kind of move through it, I'm going to point out what type of evidence I am, how I'm integrating it. But if you could go ahead, watch that, and add it to your notes, it might be helpful to write out the model as I am creating it.